the backdrop of this is this deadline that's coming up on the 1st of April, and it's not really a deadline. It's just a time when Brandon Aiyuk has it written into his contract that he's getting a bonus of a significant amount of money. And the 49ers, there's been a lot of trade speculation. And then suddenly 5 days before this deadline, Diana Rossini comes out with this, well, it doesn't look like there's a offer out there, and it looks like Aiyuk's most likely to stay with the Niners, almost as if somebody fed that to her with just enough time for people to take another look at Brandon Aiyuk. But let's get into that. I mean, I know you're close to Aiyuk. You've had him on your channel before. I'm sure you're somewhat invested in him. Would trading Brandon Aiyuk at this point, is it the right move? Is it the wrong move? Is it the right move for Jed's money, but the wrong move for the roster? Is it the right move for Jed's money and the right move for the roster? They're obviously going through a little bit of a cleansing of their cap. I won't call it a rebuild because there's too many talented players on this team for it to be a rebuild. They got 10 young core players. They've got 7 older core players. That's a 17-man core going into this offseason, and I'm sure they're going to try to double that core in this draft in this spring, after the draft market. So why don't we start with Aiyuk? Where are you on the Aiyuk thing? What makes some sense of it for us?
I think you did a really good job of kind of setting the table. It's based on what context, right? And I think when you look at a lot of the moves this offseason, I think a lot of the moves have been for the future, for getting, spending in a different direction than where they have been. So there's been a lot of moves that maybe fans have a hard time contextualizing because I think they see some of the additions and some of the key players that have left and say, how have we gotten better on the field? Where I think you had mentioned there's also an element to this where the front office is trying to be cognizant of the money that's being spent. And as we know, John Lynch said that at the Combine. When asked about it and when asked about, I believe it was Brandon Aiyuk specifically by Chase Sr., I believe it was. And, obviously gives that big, long-winded kind of almost like a preview of what this offseason was going to be. Yeah. And so I think that's, if they were to make that move and were to make that trade, it wouldn't be to recoup the best value possible. And I think we actually spoke about this. I think I was right after the Combine. I think we did Niners Nightly together. And I think you asked me about this question like the day that this kind of topic was brought up. And I was like, it doesn't make sense to me from a on-field perspective, from a value perspective, because he's injured. We don't know how healthy he is or when he'll be able to play. And what team is going to give up good compensation for a potential number one wide receiver to take on what effectively like a 4-year, $110 million contract, and the 2 roster triggers for 2025 and 2026 that go into effect on April 1st that effectively get Aiyuk $50 million guaranteed, right? And so there's so many elements to this, but if the 49ers were going to make that trade, it's to get out of the contract. It's not to recoup the best possible value for Aiyuk. It's to just say, you know what? We weren't a fan of giving this contract at the time. We've heard a lot about that, and this is our out, so we're going to take it. That doesn't mean, I've seen a lot of people mentioning, oh, maybe they get a 3rd round pick. And I think that would be maybe in a vacuum of Aiyuk being healthy, but considering the fact that he's not, I really have a hard time seeing the 49ers getting anything better than a 6th round, if I'm being perfectly honest, because of the contract that they are taking on for a player who has had a significant knee injury, and he's just too early on in the process to be able to determine how truly healthy he is. So if they were to make this trade, the deadline's coming up on Tuesday, it's to get out of the contract. It's not to recoup obviously you want to get assets, but I think the Diana Rossini trade, or the Diana Rossini report that you're mentioning, it's kind of to be like, you know what? I don't think the 49ers are going to get what they're asking for, looking for. So maybe that's why I don't expect something to go down.
It's interesting too. There was a guy in Cleveland, and I think his name was Frischella, who had this report that the Browns were interested. John Frischella Football.
He was very adamant that Aiyuk was getting traded last year as well.
He was adamant that Aiyuk was being traded. Yeah. So I reached out to him to see if we have him on the show, and he's like, "Hey, I'm retired from radio and podcasts. I'm an older guy, and this and that." And then so I did talk to him. He didn't want to come on the show, but I did talk to him, and he said I was told directly the Niners want a 3rd round pick. So I'm looking at the Rossini thing going, I'm sure if the Niners want a day 2 pick for Aiyuk, I'm sure that probably has gotten out. If this guy knows about it, she probably has heard about it. And just because they're not going to get that, there might not be a team out there, and maybe she's canvassed the league, and there's enough people that have said to her, hey, you know what? The Niners are not getting a day 2 pick for Brandon Aiyuk. And then she's like, I don't see anything there. But the question that we don't know the answer to, and it's one that I would love the answer to, and I kind of fear the answer, unfortunately, is how low will the Niners go? How motivated are they to get this money back for Jed? Tim Kawakami seemed to think that they could recoup $110 million. That is a huge amount of money, especially when you're talking about maybe paying roughly that or more to Brock, any day now, we're thinking. So, to me, it seems like how motivated are the Niners to get that money back? And then the question is, if that's the motivation and the Browns are interested, the Browns have 4 6th-round draft choices. So would you take Brandon Aiyuk? Would you take, a couple 6th-round picks and some nominal player to kind of muddy the transaction up a little bit? Take a Greg Newsome and 2 6ths? Would you do that? I probably would. And you might even be able to spin one of those 6th-round picks into a Bryce Huff or something like that. Another player that who could be utilized for you guys, for the Niners in 2025. So that's the question we don't know the answer to. I don't think they're getting a day 2 pick, and I think that's probably what they told everybody. But now we're inside of the 5-day mark, and now we're going to find out what the real motivation is. And I think you pegged it right. I think the motivation is not to get better. The motivation is to recoup cash. And I think the ask as far as the return is probably going to be pretty modest, because the real ask is we want to get out from underneath this $110 million commitment. So I'm a believer that John Lynch is not a good liar. I'm a believer that he tells us at the combine, and he has for like 3 years in a row, almost exactly what they're going to do. I mean, remember the Trey Lance year? It was like, hey, Trey's a great guy. We really love him, and he's really got to play. And then there's this pause, and then he's like, and that's the problem, because we got a team that's ready to win right now. And it was all of a sudden, it was like Trey Lance was a problem, and that was like when I was like, oh, Trey Lance is gone. They're trading him. Now they did trade him, but they didn't trade him until August. So that was February. So we had to endure 6 months of Krug, you're hating on Trey. He's not going anywhere. Krug, you're this. Krug, you're that. All kinds of labels and hate and vitriol coming my way just because I read John Lynch as saying he's not going to be here. Well, the same way I read that from Lynch, I read this from Lynch as we're moving on from Brandon Aiyuk. And the good part of this is that we're going to get draft picks, and we need to get younger. And he said all of it. He said that to Chase Sr. He's like, and the good part of this, and it was almost like stream of consciousness too, a stream of consciousness type quote. So I really didn't think he was picking his words. I think he was really kind of being honest and somewhat transparent. He's like, the good part of this is that, we need to get younger. We're one of the oldest teams and we're spending too much. So he never said what this was, Brad. But to me, this was we're pawning Aiyuk at a loss, 4 picks that you're not going to be impressed by. But even though you guys are going to be upset about this, there is some positive in that we need to shed salary and we need to get younger. To me, he's already told us what's going to happen. It's just a matter of, can they find a team? And would he have said it without knowing that there was a team? Probably not. My guess is he probably knew that he had some deal on the table for something. I don't know. It's an awful lot of speculation, but they're not giving us a lot to work with. I think Aiyuk's going to get moved before this deadline. Do you, or do you think he'll be back?
Well, I'll say this. I have heard that BA and the team is in a good spot. And I think, that depends on maybe who on the team you're maybe referencing. But I think with the theme of this offseason, I think we're seeing that there are moves and decisions being made that haven't been typical of the Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch era. So I think that shows that there has been a shift in philosophy. And so as a result of that, I do think there is a real potential that BA gets moved. Now, it comes down to, like you said, someone has to bite, Larry. Someone has to be willing to take on the contract and take on the injury. And I think we all can understand when Brandon Aiyuk is healthy, he is a dynamic, as dynamic as any wide receiver in the league. And who knows, what type of production he could do with more targets, more opportunities, more of a downfield, feed Aiyuk the ball type of offense. But I really do think that if the Cleveland Browns said, we're going to give you Greg Newsome, who I freaking love. He's a draft crush of mine. He's kind of buried in the depth chart right now. And they offer 2 6th-rounders. I feel like the 49ers would jump on that. I feel like they'd be like, yep, perfect. Shake hand. Let's go. We can get out of all this whole contract. What I perceive it to be is like the 49ers front office looks at this BA situation like nightmare fuel, like the whole process of it, to then actually paying him, to then him getting injured. It just feels like they want the night to wake up and the nightmare to end, and they are willing to move off of him and his contract. And, if I have to put my general manager hat on, remove my fandom, I got a lot of love for BA. But if I have to put my general manager hat on, I can understand the thought process. I can understand, man, we have an ability to get out of this deal with a player who we don't know what he will look like. We don't even know when he will play. Is it week 1? Is it week 4? Is he middle of the year? So I do think if the 49ers find someone to bite, I think they'll reel that in and they'll take the compensation to get out of that deal.
It's going to be interesting. Covering the Niners is never dull. Never dull.